When it comes to some of the most revered media in human history, a trilogy of works is something many people like to indulge in. For those of you who don't know what a trilogy is when three works are binded together, with a common thread linking them together. The most obvious forms of trilogies can be found in movies, with collections like Star Wars, Back to the Future, and Lord of the Rings. And these are interesting collections for sure, but the biggest common thread linking these works together is that they all tell an overarching story that plays out within the three films. And that's what most people who are familiar with the concept of a trilogy think of when delving into these sets of three. Thus, I often don't see many people talking about the stylistic trilogy. A stylistic trilogy is pretty special, because instead of an overarching storyline linking films together, instead, they become linked together through style and themes. This can encompass trilogies like Takashi Miike's Black Society trilogy, Dario Argento's Three Mothers trilogy, and Sergio Leone's Dollars trilogy. Stylistic trilogies, from what I've seen, normally aren't planned out like a traditional trilogy, and are instead grouped together by fans who see similarities between the three works they're looking at. Now, trilogies are no stranger to the medium of video games. You can find plenty. This includes Halo, Call of Duty, and Mass Effect. Just like how there are traditional, narrative-based trilogies found within video games, there are also stylistic trilogies as well. Which brings us to today's set games. Hi, my name is Daulton Nelson, and welcome back to Revisiting. Today we're going to be looking at three games that are put together by fans as a stylistic trilogy. One that isn't very well known, but I believe should still be played by modern audiences. This is Kirby's Dark Matter trilogy. Kirby's Dark Matter trilogy comprises of three games within Nintendo's, or more specifically HAL Laboratories', Kirby franchise. These games feature a cute, pink, ball-like character named Kirby, a being that is able to swallow its enemies and copy their abilities. The Kirby franchise is a relatively large one, and encompasses many games, most of which I think are pretty quality. The Dark Matter trilogy comes from Kirby's earlier period of games. These are Kirby's Dream Land 2, Kirby's Dream Land 3, and Kirby 64, The Crystal Shards. This set of games may be strange to you at first, because it's a trilogy that starts with the number 2. And this isn't because there wasn't a first Kirby's Dream Land, there was. You may also notice that all three games released on different platforms in different years. Thus, their immediate aesthetics are very diverse. However, as you look more closely, you'll start to see what links these three games together. First of which is the name of the trilogy itself. Each game sees its primary antagonist come in the form of Dark Matter, a black, misty, evil figure that is as much of a spheroid as the protagonist. But instead of a cute face, Dark Matter sports a singular, giant, eerie-looking eyeball. Another way the series links together is through its director. The Dark Matter trilogy was not directed by series creator Masahiro Sakurai, who was most likely working on Kirby Superstar and Super Smash Bros. At the time. Instead, all three games were directed by Shinichi Shimomura, a very mysterious figure. So little is known about Shimomura that their gender, or what they did after this trilogy, is unknown. However, Shimomura didn't come out of nowhere. They got their start doing map design for Kirby's Adventure, and continued with that role for a few other key Kirby titles, until they got their chance to direct Kirby's Dream Land 2. I can't say Shimomura is the reason why these three Kirby titles stand out amongst the rest, but it's clear they had a unique take on the Kirby property. The Dark Matter trilogy shares many elements with each other. All three games have collectibles, secret endings, puzzles, certain bosses, creative copy abilities, and great music. All three are also structured very similarly, with themed worlds, each with a collection of levels adhering to the theme. Of course, we're never really going to understand what this trilogy has to offer unless we play these games. So let's dive right in with the game that starts the trilogy off. Originally released in 1995 for the Game Boy, Kirby's Dream Land 2 came out 3 years after the debut title in the franchise, of which saw one mainline title and 3 spin-off titles released in between the two. The mainline title, Kirby's Adventure, saw the pink protagonist evolve past his swallowing and spitting repertoire to now include copy abilities. A copy ability happens when Kirby inhales a certain type of enemy to gain their power. For example, gulping down a fire enemy will allow Kirby to use the burning ability. Meanwhile, a snowman will give Kirby the freeze ability. Kirby's Adventure was a huge moment not only in the Kirby franchise, but for Nintendo fans in general, as it has and still does receive high praise. So, to follow up something like Kirby's Adventure had to have been a daunting task. HAL Laboratories' approach to Kirby's Dream Land 2 saw them taking a more explorative, puzzle-like approach to Kirby, as well as take a page out of Super Mario World's playbook by giving Kirby rideable allies. The story of Dream Land 2 begins with the evil Dark Matter taking over the ruler of Dreamland, King DDD, in order to mold Dreamland into a dark world. How he does this is by removing the rainbow bridges connecting the rainbow islands of Dreamland to one another. It's up to Kirby and friends to put the islands back together and stop Dark Matter's evil plans. These 3 friends are major additions to the Kirby formula, creating a mechanic that would last the entire trilogy, and arguably Kirby Superstar as well. Each friend is very useful for Kirby's quest, as each embodies a different type of transportation. There is Rick, a hamster that carries Kirby on his back. He traverses the land, and is resistant to terrain-related obstacles like slippery ice. But if the land is too restricting, you can try the sky with Ku, the owl. Ku can fly very fast, and reach places otherwise unreachable. He's a bit hard to control, and Kirby can't inhale while being carried by Ku. However, this isn't a problem for Kine, the fish. A born sea swimmer, Kine can brush past heavy currents with ease, and blast through any body of water, but his effectiveness out of the water is a different story. Each friend can be encountered by rescuing them from mini-bosses. Once freed, just walk into them and you team up, using your abilities to help each other out. Kirby's copy abilities, which make a return here, will change slightly when paired up with a friend. For example, using fire with Rick will see him breathe fire. Meanwhile, using spark with Kine will put an illuminating light bulb in the fish's mouth. And using parasol with Ku will cause the pair to spin in a deadly tornado-like attack. The creativity within the mixtures is something to behold. The player is given various options to take on their foes. Every time the game is paused, you can see Kirby and their friend doing a tribal war dance in preparation for their upcoming adversaries. It should also be noted that there are 2 more friends that are a little more rare to come across, Gooey and his female counterpart. Gooey doesn't actually pair up with Kirby like the other friends, and can only be found if you are already paired up with a friend that would have been saved from the boss fight before. Instead, Gooey will heal Kirby completely. Meanwhile, the female counterpart will grant Kirby an extra life, and is important for acquiring a 100% completion. Speaking of which, another new addition to Kirby are hidden collectibles in each Rainbow Island of the game, in the form of Rainbow Drops. Rainbow Drops are instrumental to reforming the rainbows that connect Dreamland together, and thus essential to defeating Dark Matter. However, they're not required to beat the game. Rather, the fight against Dark Matter is only given to those who seek out the hidden drops, and they're not easy to get. Each Rainbow Island in Dreamland has an assortment of levels. The Rainbow Drop is hidden in one of these levels, but finding the right level isn't all you have to do. Once you find it, you'll notice the drop is put behind some peculiar blocks. These blocks can only be disposed of with certain copy abilities, and sometimes certain friends combined with certain copy abilities will only do the trick. Often what you need isn't obvious, encouraging player experimentation. This is the explorative puzzle-like aspect mentioned earlier. Dreamland 2 asks players to search through levels, only to then experiment with mixtures of copy abilities and friends in order to get the objects they need to take out the true evil of the game. Despite these hidden rainbow drops, the rest of Kirby's Dream Land 2 is very straightforward. There are 7 rainbow islands Kirby and friends must go through, each of which has a collection of levels that can be accessed through a hub not much different from the ones found within Kirby's Adventure. The player must beat each level in numbered order before facing the boss of the island. Once that boss is defeated, Kirby will move on to the next island. Looking deeper into a common level found within the game, you'll find that Dreamland 2 plays a lot like your normal Kirby game. Players go from left to right on a side-scrolling platform-filled scene to get to the door they need to continue the level. Once the end is reached, you'll go through a catapulting minigame where the player must hit a button at the right time while Kirby is being pulled down by a cloud. Kirby will then be propelled upwards based on the player's performance. The higher Kirby is launched, the better the reward is for the player. It's a minigame pulled right out of Kirby's Adventure. While in a level, in addition to moving and inhaling, Kirby can also jump and float, although, confusingly, those are both two separate buttons in this game. The player can take 6 hits, visualized as blocks on the UI below, before they are defeated. You'll also see that Kirby has lives as well, which can be increased by collecting the mini stars strewn across the levels. Lose all of your lives and it's game over, although it's not very punishing. Starting your game again after game over will just take you back to the beginning of the level you were defeated in, so there's no sweat. In fact, the beginning of the game is a very easy breeze, with the first island of the game taking around 10 minutes to get through. Of course, as the game goes on, the difficulty and length of the levels start to grow. Although, to say that this rise in difficulty is caused by design alone is to be a little wrong. Particularly, as you play through the game, you'll find that the small screen resolution means that oftentimes there will be enemies that will come flying at Kirby before the player can register that they're coming. Regardless, most enemies are small and weak, only taking one hit to deal with them. In fact, the quick way you dispose of enemies brings a real snappy feeling to the gameplay. The bosses you face are more of a challenge, with each boss taking multiple hits before they're defeated. Every so often while going through the levels, you'll encounter a mini-boss. These bosses will repeat throughout the game, so it's best to learn their pattern. The scenes you'll find these mini-bosses in will have a sack chained to the top. One of your friends is trapped in this sack, and it's up to you to free them by defeating their captor. You'll find using copy abilities against all of the bosses in the game can be a bit ineffective. I found it's easier to beat them by inhaling any debris from their attacks and spitting it out right back at them. The same strategy can also be applied to the tougher island bosses of the game, of which there are some returning favorites here, like Wispy Woods, Mr. Shine and Mr. Bright, and Kracko. But there are also some new contenders looking to take Kirby and his friends down. The King of Dreamland, DDD, can especially be tough, with attacks that will swallow you up and crush you down. Although, no boss is more challenging than Dark Matter, who is only accessible if Kirby collects the Rainbow Drop from each island in order to forge the Rainbow Sword, a weapon that can slice through the air. Dark Matter fights Kirby in the sky, making movement a little awkward, with some momentum applied to the controls. Dark Matter itself has 2 forms, the second tougher than the first. Kirby's boss fights always rely on pattern memorization, and there is no exception here. The Dark Matter fight requires patience, and you don't want to get it game over during it, otherwise you'll have to fight through King DDD once again to get back to Dark Matter. Luckily, the soundtrack of the game isn't as willing to push you away. A lot of music in Kirby's Dream Land 2 is very bright and happy, with some great chiptune melodies to get stuck in your head. I especially like the themes composed for each friend. These tracks take the personality traits of each character and brings them out through song. This welcoming atmosphere extends to the look of the game as well. Despite being monochrome, the sprite work has had a lot of care put into it. Characters are very animated and lively. The amount of frames drawn must have been putting the Game Boy to its limit. A lot of the enemies are small and have a uniform size, making them very cute, and displays great character designs that are conveyed with only a little. The environments are also varied. In fact, the game never looks boring. And while this attention to detail within the looks of the game speaks to the great quality of Kirby's Dream Land 2 as a whole, it is also a sign of what is to come, as the art and gameplay of Kirby would improve tenfold in the next entry of the Dark Matter Trilogy. Two years doesn't seem like a lot of time in the grand scheme of things, but for the development team at HAL, it was a chance to improve Kirby well beyond their showings on the Game Boy. A year after the release of Kirby's Dream Land 2, saw the pink protagonist debut on the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, or SNES, with 1996's Kirby Superstar. Another landmark title for the franchise, Superstar saw series creator Masahiro Sakurai return with a game that introduced new copy abilities, this time with expanded movesets. Obtaining a copy ability would give Kirby a hat that visualized what Kirby could do. Kirby could also sacrifice the copy ability to get a helper. Somewhat similar to the Friends of Dreamland 2, a helper inherits the moveset of the copy ability Kirby sacrificed, and instead of merging with Kirby, the two would remain separate, fighting enemies individually. Kirby Superstar also sported cooperative play, an omnibus format with multiple games packed into the cartridge, and minigames that would require one button to play. Furthermore, within the same year saw the release of the Nintendo 64 in Japan, a console with a 64-bit central processing unit that saw gaming enter a new era with a new axis. The console would become available to even more countries come 1997. As you can guess, the SNES was losing relevancy, and the releases for the console started to decline. The last game to be published for the SNES by Nintendo in North America would be our next entry into the Dark Matter Trilogy, Kirby's Dream Land 3. A late release for the SNES, Kirby's Dream Land 3 shows the prowess of the developers at HAL. Dream Land 3 is a technical marvel, taking full advantage of the SNES's technology. Nowhere is this more evident than in the look of the game. Mostly all of the sprites in the game look as if they were drawn with colored pencils and then scanned in. The details within the sprites are marvelous and lively. The great animations found within Dream Land 2 are expanded and improved upon, becoming more expressive. This expressiveness carries over to the environments, which now feature multiple scrolling layers in the foreground and background that keep the game's energy going. The environments also become more varied, as HAL could now work with more colors and processing power. Their themed worlds became a reality. The music also saw a significant upgrade, with compositions becoming more layered and the overall sound going for a more welcoming, warm feeling all around, while still accompanying the fast-paced adventure Kirby is known for. The sound effects are also very cute and soft, with nothing too harsh being broadcasted. But what about the gameplay? Dream Land 2 saw Shimomura and their team go for a more explorative and puzzle-like experience. Yet, just a year prior to Dream Land 3, Kirby was in multiple games at once in Superstar, not to mention all of the innovations to the franchise that game brought. Let's start with the friend system introduced in Kirby's Dream Land 2. In Dream Land 2, Rick, Ku, and Kine helped Kirby on the quest to save Dreamland by pairing up to use copy abilities in new ways. Dream Land 3 sees all three of these friends return to help Kirby again, with the addition of 3 more friends to add their skills. First there's Nago, the cat. Nago moves fast, rolls Kirby around like a ball, and can double jump with a somersault. Next is Pitch, a white-eye bird who's spherical shaped, like Kirby. Instead of carrying Kirby around, our protagonist carries Pitch around, save for when the player dashes. Finally there is Choo Choo, a pink octopus wearing a big red bow. A potential love interest for Kirby, Choo Choo rests upon Kirby's head, and will help Kirby swallow up enemies, and climb ceilings. Now with 6 friends, the possibilities of play become numerous, with even more fusions of friend and copy ability becoming available to the player. Gooey makes his return as well, but now has a mirror of Kirby, and can only be played if a second player drops in for cooperative play. The improved graphics and processing power now sees each animal become sad or depressed that Kirby didn't pick them to help out, as well as the numerous animations that play out in the normal, side-scrolling gameplay. It also saw more creativity displayed in the synergies of friend and copy ability. While there are some returning combinations here, Dreamland 3 sees Hal flex their artistic muscles, with the wide array of new moves that Kirby can use to deal with their foes. Sure, it isn't Kirby Superstar. Instead of a fleshed out moveset, Dreamland 3's copy abilities only perform one function like its predecessor. But the amount of variety Shimomura and team put on display is staggering. The normal side-scrolling gameplay of Kirby has been tweaked from Dreamland 2 as well. Compared to its predecessor, Dreamland 3 has Kirby at its most agile, moving quickly and jumping high. Jumping and floating are now one button. There are a few new things Kirby can do, like slide kick, or damaging things by jumping into them, but only if you're right below them. Copy abilities are more useful as attacks for both normal enemies and bosses. The increased speed means the game is easier to navigate. As such, you will need to collect more stars to gain an extra life. Which is okay, because there are more stars to go around this time. The biggest flaw of the game is inherited from Dreamland 2. The screen resolution is much bigger this time around, but the scroll speed of the screen is a little too slow, which is a problem given the faster pace of the game sees the enemies coming at you a lot quicker. This is especially a problem upon entering a new scene, where the screen will take longer than usual to start following Kirby. There was quite a bit of damage taken from this for me, so this problem was big enough to mention here. So what about the story? Well, it all starts when Kirby and Gooey are fishing on a peaceful day, until dark matter returns and takes over Kirby's home planet, Popstar. King DDD of Dreamland has once again been taken over. Him and his minions start doing terrible things. It's up to Kirby and friends to once again save Dreamland, and drive dark matter away once and for all. As such, instead of taking place on the Rainbow Islands, each world in the game takes place on each of the 5 tips of Popstar. Each with their own themes and aesthetics, each tip of Popstar stands out from the last. And while the game can be welcoming and colorful, looks can be deceiving. In addition to the rise of difficulty as the game goes on, you can also notice some rather unnerving elements in Kirby's Dreamland 3. Batamon is a Kirby lookalike that is normally out of reach and will only walk around. Mumbies are floating mummy heads, ready to stop Kirby in its tracks. Some enemies are made out of pure darkness, like Mario and Nido. Yet, the creepiest of them all has to go to Pilu, a face that will appear out of nowhere and gobble Kirby up. No doubt creepy, it makes defeating dark matter all the more prevalent. So, how do we stop it? Well, just like Kirby's Dreamland 2, dark matter cannot be reached unless the player collects all hidden objects in the game. Instead of rainbow drops, this time around Kirby must collect heart stars. How to acquire these is relatively more complex than in Dreamland 3's predecessor. First, instead of stars being hidden in each world, there is now a star hidden in each level of the game. To get this star, you need to complete a certain mission objective for someone in each level. This someone can be seen in the level select screen. Most are denizens of Dreamland, but there are also a few familiar faces that make their appearance. What these characters will have you do for a Heart Star will depend on each level, and can be a bit vague given that the game never tells you outright what you need to do. There are some consistencies found within some of the missions here, like flower missions, rescue missions, carving a shape out of blocks, head-scratching reflex quizzes, and more. The game will throw you a bone, as a jingle will play whenever you find an object of importance to the mission. These challenges become more difficult as the game goes on, so it's wise to play through a world twice, once casually, then subsequently going back to collect what you've missed. The blocks that can be destroyed with certain copy abilities also make a comeback in Dreamland 3, but this time around, they are better designed, with the symbol of the required ability being drawn right on the block. Collecting all the heart stars in a world and beating the boss will cleanse that tip of Popstar of darkness. Speaking of bosses, each one is multi-phased, giving Kirby a real challenge. The 5th tip of Popstar sees you fight against the King of Dreamland himself, King DDD. DDD is much easier to fight this time around, but watch out, as the 2nd phase sees him being flown through the air at the control of dark matter. Defeating DDD, while having all of the heart stars, will cleanse the King of Dark Matter's control. But the fight isn't over yet. The heart stars come together to form the Love stick, and with the ultimate weapon in hand, Kirby makes way to the middle of Popstar for one final battle in the Hyper Zone. Once there, dark matter will reveal itself. A fight ensues between our protagonist and this evil foe. Dark matter behaves much in the same way as its 2nd form from Dreamland 2, but it's definitely slower this time around. Defeating it will reveal an even more intimidating mastermind behind the scenes, Zero. Zero is a giant white orb with a blood-red eyeball. His stamina is plentiful, so the hits Kirby deals give out less damage. Zero shoots miniature dark matters and even his own blood. Draining Zero's health will only cause the eyeball to burst out of its shell in bloody revenge. The eyeball is quick, but its only method of attack is to run into Kirby. As long as you do wide circles around it, you should be fine. On defeat of Zero, Kirby will use the Love stick to expunge the darkness of Popstar, bringing peace to the colorful planet yet again. Kirby's Dreamland 3 is a worthy sequel to Hal's previous Dreamland entry, as well as an invaluable entry to the Kirby franchise. The art style is colorful and vibrant, the gameplay is improved and expanded upon, and Kirby's adventure has gone from a few islands to worldwide. Thus, it only makes sense that for the last entry into this trilogy, Kirby would have to go interplanetary. In 1997, 3D technology was still in its infancy, but by 2000, 3D video games had proved their worthiness in the medium. 1996's Quake showed that the FPS genre was more than Doom clones. Super Mario 64 laid out the blueprint for the 3D platformer, and almost effortlessly brought a legend into the new era. And just a year later, the Blue Bomber brought action platformers into 3D gaming with Mega Man Legends. As years passed by, gaming was entering a new millennium. A new millennium was bringing a new gaming format to players and developers alike: the compact disc. Being cheaper to produce with more storage to work with, the CD was quickly taking over the normal cartridge format of old. Seeing where the future lied, Nintendo made attempts to bring their consoles up to speed with these new CDs. A potential collaborator now turned rival. Sony had been seeing success with the optical disc format for years with their console, the PlayStation. In fact, a follow-up to the PlayStation was just around the corner. Nintendo couldn't afford to waste time. Their response? The Nintendo 64 disk drive, or the 64DD for short. An add-on for the base 64 console, the disk drive would play CD-based games. To garner excitement and momentum for this hardware, Nintendo had several games go into development for it. One of these was Kirby 64, the first mainline entry in the franchise since Dreamland 3. Unfortunately, the 64DD saw several delays before release, and when released in Japan exclusively, it was a commercial failure. Support for it ended quickly. As for Kirby 64, it would release in the year 2000 on the Nintendo 64. As a regular cartridge game, with the full title being Kirby 64, The Crystal Shards. Kirby 64 is a pretty special game, as it is one of the first 2.5D platformers to exist. A 2.5D platformer is a basic 2D side-scrolling platformer, but uses 3D technology to wrap this flat gameplay onto a complex path that takes advantage of 3D's depth. This freedom of movement also allows for the camera displaying the action to be dynamic, interpolating between set angles as the player progresses through a scene. This basically means that, functionally, Kirby 64 plays very similarly to its predecessors, but the way this is displayed is more dynamic. This also means that instead of 2D sprites, Kirby 64 uses textured 3D meshes for its game objects. Despite the 64's increase in technological capabilities, the 3D models in the game aren't as detailed as what we're used to seeing today. Instead, the models in Kirby 64 contain a low poly count to keep performance consistent. Instead, to display the usual cute and welcoming style of Kirby, the developers use bright, saturated hues for the colors. Mostly everything is made out of basic shapes, and any textures that aren't a solid color will instead feature patterns or brightly colored tessellations. Despite the seemingly low fidelity of the game, this simplistic colorful approach holds up the look for Kirby 64 to this day. Before we continue, I should admit now that Kirby 64 is one of the first video games I've ever owned and played, and because of that, I have a lot of memories playing this game, and may look at Kirby 64 with those rose-tinted glasses. So I would like to say that I personally still enjoy Kirby 64, and will frame the game positively. So I thought I would make you aware of any potential nostalgic bias before moving forward. I see Kirby 64 as both an evolution and a culmination of the Dark Matter trilogy, taking all the best parts of the previous games and injecting them into this new software that has ideas of its own. An example of an idea carrying over from the previous games is the Friends mechanic. In the previous titles, Kirby would pair up with a friend, changing up how the possessed copy ability would function, and giving some sort of new way to navigate the scenes within the game. In Kirby 64, however, all 6 of the friends of the previous games are now gone, save for a copy ability where they all make a cameo appearance. Instead, Kirby has 3 new friends to pair up with this time around. Waddle Dee sees the common henchman of King Dedede become a useful passive ally to Kirby, helping by piloting rafts and minecarts, as well as help carve out routes for Kirby to continue on the adventure. Adeline is a painter whose art comes to life. She helps Kirby by drawing Maxim tomatoes to restore health, or 1-ups if health is already full. The third ally is the King of Dreamland himself. The only friend that acts somewhat similarly to previous titles, Dedede can be found in certain sections of the game. Kirby will ride on his back, as the player takes control of Dedede to use his hammer to break through walls. Once the player finds the end of the scene, Dedede will throw Kirby into the next one. Kirby 64 also brings back certain locations from the previous games, as well as certain puzzles and bosses. Of course, collectibles make their way to Kirby 64 as well. Instead of rainbow drops or heart stars, now the collectibles are the titular crystal shards. These blue crystals can be found in each level, like in Dreamland 3. But now there are multiple shards per level, and mission objectives are now gone. Instead, the shards can be either out in the open, or hidden behind an object that must be broken with a certain copy ability. These objects are, most of the time, color-coded to the ability you need to have in order to destroy it. It's like the blocks from the previous titles, but now implemented in a more natural sense. The biggest change to Kirby's gameplay is how copy abilities work this time around. In a system similar to Gunstar Heroes, Kirby can now hold 2 copy abilities instead of 1. The 2 abilities in possession will have their properties combined, for an attack that is a fusion of the base abilities. For example, Fire plus Cutter gives you a giant fire sword. Stone plus Bomb will allow you to throw a stick of dynamite that will explode into rocks. And Stone plus Cutter will cut Kirby into a stone version of the friends from the previous games. As you can see, Hal's creativity shines through yet again, with these copy ability synergies making for a very fun experience. In addition to possessing a copy ability, you can now leverage whatever you have above your head, and hurl it at your foes. A base ability will be represented by a 4-point star. Throw this at an enemy who would normally give Kirby an ability, and that star will now become an 8-point star, and has fused with that enemy's ability. Swallow the star, and you have yourself a combination ability. You can also raise anything you inhale above your head, including enemies. Some of these enemies will still execute their function, helping Kirby out in the process. There are a few more additions to Kirby's gameplay worth mentioning, one being more of an emphasis on exploration this time around. You'll find that Shimomura's team has become a little more clever, hiding things that can easily be missed just by going left instead of right. Kirby's float ability is now limited. The pink protagonist can now only stay in the air for a certain amount of time. so be careful when floating over danger. Where Kirby used to blow bubbles underwater, Kirby can now attack as if on land. Kirby can also inhale enemies underwater as well. A welcome change from the norm. While already mentioned extensively, the dedication to the 2.5D elements of Kirby 64 is really something to behold. Just try throwing something. You can see an object follow the set path the developers have laid out. The camera angles are also well framed, and add to the progression of the scenes. Finally, Kirby 64 tries its end-level minigames differently, with Kirby now launching himself to a point on a picnic blanket. First set the angle, and then the power, and then see if Kirby lands on the object you were aiming for. Of course, gameplay needs pretense, and Kirby 64's story delivers a narrative larger in scale and in scope. In a first for Kirby, full-motion cinematics display a scene where fairies live peacefully on the planet Ripplestar. On this day, an evil dark cloud belonging to dark matter engulfs the planet. Ribbon, a pink fairy with a ribbon in her hair, worries about the cloud gaining control of the powerful crystal located in the fairy palace. With the help of the fairy queen, Ribbon rides the crystal into space, just as Ripplestar is swallowed whole by darkness. Ribbon doesn't get too far, as 3 dark matter orbs break off from Ripplestar to give chase. As the chase goes on, the orbs attack Ribbon and her crystal. Eventually, they manage to break the crystal into shards, of which fall onto the planets of the universe. Ribbon, out cold, is also falling with a few pieces of the crystal, and crash lands into Kirby on Popstar of all places. Kirby and Ribbon combine the 2 pieces they find back together, and Kirby resolves to help Ribbon rid the universe of the evil dark matter. From here, Kirby, Ribbon, and friends collect the crystal shards as they go from planet to planet using the crystal. Like the previous dark matter games, each planet is a themed world, changing up aesthetics and mechanics with each new environment. There are some really memorable levels in Kirby 64. The woods level on Popstar is serene, with a luscious environment full of orange and yellow leaves. The music is relaxing, yet mystical. Rockstar hides a wealth of alien technology in its pyramid. Aquastar's beaches may be full of enemies, but they're also full of color and fun under the sun. Neostar's volcano is hot and tough. The lava will deal damage if dipped into, while the enemies will keep heat on Kirby if any mistakes are made. Perhaps a statement on human industrialization and man-made climate change, Shiverstar's factory is automated to kill Kirby where it stands, while gloomy music plays in the background. And finally, Ripplestar's castle is creepily engulfed in darkness, as the dark matter threat grows ever closer. What waits at the end of Ripplestar is Miracle Matter, a white icosahedron with red eyes on each of its faces. Miracle Matter will use the elements of Kirby's copy abilities against them. The boss will go into a form that represents the element they're using. Kirby does have a way to attack back. While in an elemental form, there will normally be an object Kirby can inhale to obtain the corresponding copy ability. Using that copy ability against the same type of element is the only way to cause damage against Miracle Matter. But each elemental form has its own durability, and destroying one form will cause a few eyes to disappear off of Miracle Matter's base form. But the fight isn't over yet. Kirby has to defeat all of Miracle Matter's forms to beat it. It's a tough, but very well designed fight. If the player defeats Miracle Matter while having all of the crystal shards in their possession, then the dark cloud over Ripplestar will escape into the center of the universe, creating a gigantic dark orb called Dark Star. This is where the final battle takes place. Ribbon and Kirby team up to face against the true mastermind, Zero 2. A fallen angel type figure, it's similar in look to Dreamland 3's Zero, but Zero 2 has wings on its sides, with multicolored feathers, a halo, and a bandage on its top, and a spiked tail on its bottom. The game changes things up by turning into a third-person shooter, where the player will shoot the crystal's energy as Zero 2. Meanwhile, the music is epic and sweeping, signaling the finality of the fight. The way to beat Zero 2 is more puzzle-like than challenging, but doing so will bring an end to this trilogy. Peace is restored to the galaxy, and Kirby and friends are rewarded with medals by the fairies for their heroism. Kirby even nets a kiss upon the forehead from Ribbon. It's a sweet end to a fantastic trilogy. After the release of Kirby 64, The Crystal Shards, director Shinichi Shimura only directed one other title, Kirby Nightmare in Dreamland. A remake of the classic Kirby's Adventure, Nightmare in Dreamland features enhanced gameplay and graphics. After this title, Shimomura seemed to have just disappeared, their identity a mystery to this day. This wasn't the only high-profile staff member to leave HAL. After his work on the 2003 racing game Kirby Air Ride, series creator Masahiro Sakurai also left the company, citing how he grew tired of the sequelization HAL would often encourage. And with the release of Kirby 64, some would see this title as the end of an era for Kirby, as, with the exception of Kirby Air Ride, no Kirby titles would see a home console release until 2010's Kirby Epic Yarn. And the series wouldn't properly see a return to form until 2011's Kirby's Return to Dreamland. Instead, Kirby games would remain on handhelds, where HAL would experiment with the franchise. A cursory glance at all this aftermath might lead on that HAL moved on from the Dark Matter trilogy pretty quickly, but there does seem to be some influence from the trilogy that has carried over to the future titles. One aspect kept were the exploratory, collectible elements. These would see a resurgence in games such as Kirby and the Amazing Mirror, Kirby Squeak Squad, and Kirby's Return to Dreamland. The willingness to give Kirby a new visual style, like Dreamland 3's colored pencil style, is also executed in Kirby's Epic Yarn's yarn-based world, Kirby and the Rainbow Curse's claymation, and Kirby Canvas Curse's oil paint graphics. And it seems Dark Matter hasn't quite been taken care of for good. Dark Matter makes an appearance in many a modern Kirby title as a secret boss. There are also rumors that certain characters that have been introduced post-Kirby 64 are related to the Evil Fiend. Characters like Dark Mind, Magalore, and Dark Nebula. And once you play the games, it's easy to see why both HAL and a community of fans still hold these games with high regard years after their release. The Dark Matter trilogy contains 3 of the most unique and creative Kirby titles in the franchise, while also being fun to play. I highly recommend you play the trilogy. If I were to give each game in the trilogy a score, it would go a middling 7 out of 10 for Kirby's Dream Land 2, a high 9 out of 10 for Kirby's Dream Land 3, and a voided score for Kirby 64, The Crystal Shards, because of nostalgic bias. Trilogies make up some of the most revered media in human history. They allow all who participate in them to go through their consistencies, find individual favorite moments, and prompt discussion about what it all means as a whole. And while it has its community, Kirby's Dark Matter trilogy deserves to be played by all, and has more than enough interesting content in its 3 titles to satisfy all fans. If you haven't heard of the Dark Matter trilogy before today, then you owe it to yourself to play through one of Kirby's most creative periods. I've been Daulton Nelson. I hope to see you in the next episode of Revisiting.